NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting books, radio, podcasts, film, television, theater, and more to bridge science and the humanities, and the listeners who support this NPR station.
This is Charlotte Talks. I'm Mike Collins. If you're planning a trip from one city to another outside the Northeast, you'll likely choose to drive or fly. But trains have crisscrossed the nation since the 19th century, and at least in North Carolina, more people than ever are opting to follow the suggestion of commercials that ran 50 years ago.
If you're traveling near or far, don't hassle with a plane or car. Amtrak has a better way. See the country, travel Amtrak. Easy come and easy go. It's easy coming through the traffic, easy going through the rain or snow. What a country, now you'll see it. Take the train and just lean back, 'cause you'll get to go from downtown right to downtown when you go Amtrak.
Amtrak tried to lure people away from flying a long time ago, and now passenger trains are more popular than ever in our state. More than 700,000 passengers rode last year.
Maybe the time is right for taking the train instead of that flight. Going more places, really getting around. So nice taking off and never leaving the ground. All aboard, all aboard, all aboard Amtrak.
Officials say existing passenger rail is thriving, and new projects like high-speed passenger rail between Raleigh and Richmond came a step closer to reality last year, along with other lines to other destinations. In Europe, taking the train is commonplace, but not here. So is increasing ridership a trend that will last? Can more people be convinced that train travel can actually be convenient and practical and a legitimate alternative to flying? Amtrak thought so in 1985.
Next time you're planning to fly somewhere, see what a thrill it is to fly on a train.
All aboard, all aboard, all aboard Amtrak.
I feel this need to get on a train right now. So let's take a closer look at this old-fangled form of travel, why it appears to be gaining popularity, and what the future may hold. Jason Orthner is Rail Division Director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Beau Mills is chairman of the recently formed 501c3 North Carolinians for Passenger Rail. And Richard Stradling is transportation reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thanks for being here. Jason, before we talk about the increase in train ridership, let's talk about you. You seem to be the perfect person to be the Rail Division Director of the North Carolina Department of Transportation because, as I understand it, you have had a long-standing love affair with trains that dates back to your childhood. And I have met a lot of other people who just love trains, and there are many of them young adults. From your point of view, why are trains so alluring?
That is a great question to lead off with, Mike. I have had a fascination with trains really since very, very young. Probably like many kids, I got a HO scale model train for Christmas when I was 7 years old. And I just really fell in love with the movement of the train, the switching of the cars, and all the things that go along with it. And as I grew older, just became fascinated with the system, the size of the trains, the largest moving things on land, the efficiency of the operation, the different places they go, and the types of businesses and services they provide. Just a fascinating network of transportation, and a lot of kids trains are not in your everyday sphere, and so going and seeing them like I did as a child and then as a young adult just grew my interest to the point where I went into engineering and wanted to build the systems of the future.
I guess kids today still ask for trains at Christmas time. I know I had an old Lion Hill back in the day. years ago. Richard, in January, you reported in the News and Observer that last year was another record year for train travel in the state for the third year in a row. What do you think is driving this increase in popularity?
Well, I think a number of factors. One, they added an extra round trip of the Piedmont between Raleigh and Charlotte. So now you have 4 round trips daily between the two cities. And then if you add in the Carolinian, which also makes a round trip, it continues on up to New York. That's 5 round trips a day between the two cities. And so it's more convenient than ever, really, to get on a train. It appeals to more schedules that, people can see it as an option. So I think that helps. I think they've done a better job of marketing. They don't have the jingles that you just played, but they've got some special trains that they've been doing and special promotions that they've done online. And I think they've gotten the brand out there, the NC by Train brand out there a little better as well.
Nobody has the jingles I just played because
No.
nobody uses jingles anymore. Maybe they should rethink that because they're catchy. So Richard, where are most passengers in North Carolina who use the train? Where are they going? Just between Raleigh and Charlotte primarily, or are they taking it to New York? Are they taking it to
Well,
other places?
yeah, so we do have through trains. We have the Florida trains that pass through Raleigh and Rocky Mount. We have the train to New Orleans and Atlanta that goes through Charlotte and Greensboro up to Washington, D.C. So there's some people catching those. Those aren't always the most convenient. They come here in the middle of the night usually, but you do have the one train that goes to New York. And I've taken it to Washington a few times, and I've taken my family on a trip to Philadelphia on that train. But the bulk of the people who are riding the train in North Carolina are riding between Raleigh and Charlotte. It passes through Durham, Burlington, Greensboro, other cities in between. So not everybody's going that whole distance, but that's where the bulk of the passengers are.
So, Jason, ridership in 2024 was up 12%, I understand, from 2023, and up 55% since pre-pandemic 2019. Can data tell you, as the person who kind of runs the rail division for NCDOT, does it tell you whether this is a blip, a fad, a trend, or something that could be long-lasting and growing into the future?
So, one thing about rail travel, and it's funny because I'm harkening back a little bit to the jingle, is that it is a comfortable way to travel. It is affordable, and it has the unique ability to be productive too. In other words, instead of driving between your destinations and that being your primary or should be your primary objective when you're doing that activity, you're doing other things. Whether that's relaxing, work, this, pleasure, watching movies or things like that. So there's a lot of things that are driving it as a way, to get back and forth. The cost of car ownership is going up. A lot of folks are choosing to drive later. And then we have population getting older too. So on both the front end and the back end of our population demographics, you've got reasons for people to travel by a mode other than car to get over the distance of where they're trying to go.
One of the things that's driving it is that you're not driving it.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you can get to the train by either a short drop off or an Uber trip, to a station. Then the bulk of your trip is on the train, very comfortable. You can do those things, and as we see this. The people that are riding our train are across all demographics, all economic demographics, all ethnic demographics. It really is a microcosm of our state using the train service.
So Beau Mills is champing at the bit here because he recently retired as director of the North Carolina Metropolitan Mayors Coalition and the North Carolina League of Municipalities Director of Urban Affairs, where some of his work concentrated on transportation. But now, Beau, you're with the new advocacy group, a bunch of train aficionados, North Carolinians for Passenger Rail. It's only about 3 months old. So who started it, why, and what exactly are you advocating for?
We are a group of folks that include economic development officials, environmentalists, business leaders, a variety of people that have come together to really advocate on behalf of passenger rail in our state. And I think Jason and Richard have hit it really well. It is a popular choice for North Carolinians, and I think a good choice for the future. And I think sets our state apart in many ways. In a very competitive world, North Carolina needs everything it can to compete for jobs and opportunities for folks. And we believe passenger rail is part of that, part of the milieu that we need to compete. Virginia, a state north of us, is investing hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions, right, Jason? I mean, they are very enthusiastic about their work in Virginia. And by the way, who's the state that beat North Carolina under Site Selection magazine as the #1 state to invest in for jobs? And that was Virginia. So we can only look north to see that we really do need to step up our game.
And you attribute that to their plans for expanding train travel?
I think it's a combination of investing in a lot of infrastructure. I think rail is certainly going to be a part of that, especially for the future. And I think, Mike, you mentioned earlier that you rode the train as a college student. Well, guess what? Young people are really excited about trains, not just kids, but teenagers and 20-somethings. And that's really where the competition is in the future economy of the world. And that is competing for the smart young people.
So, Beau, your organization has 5 goals. The expansion of passenger rail service connecting communities within North Carolina, securing sustainable funding, building support for rail among governments and businesses and others, promoting economic development, which you just referred to through rail connections, and enhancing equity and access. 2 months ago, none of that would have raised an eyebrow. But Donald Trump has scrubbed any reference to diversity, equity, and inclusion from all things governmental and military in the United States and has vowed not to fund anything with those words in it. Equity is in it. Does this worry you that this may become a stumbling block for your efforts?
No, I'm not worried about it at all, Mike, because access is really key, and access to jobs, access to rural communities, commuting to urban areas where jobs are. I think that is really an important thing. I mean, we can use different words, but really it's about creating opportunity, giving people choices and options for travel. So I'm not worried about that. I am worried that, the federal budget is going to be tight. I know that they're going to have to make hard decisions, but I'm confident that we are going to make a strong case for the projects we're doing in North Carolina around passenger rail. We have data to support our success. And I think that's something that Jason can point to when he advocates for his work. And I think that we will, the advocates that I'm working with all across the state for passenger rail are going to be able to point to that success and how important it is to the future of the state.
Richard, in your reporting, if I read it correctly, you point out that the numbers that have been released about train ridership figures indicate increased ridership. That indicates increased ridership. Do not include numbers for long distance trains like the one you referenced in New York and the Floridian, which takes you to Florida. Yeah. Do we have any figures on how those routes are being used?
I understand that nationwide Amtrak ridership is up as well, and maybe Jason has more specific numbers, but I don't have the specifics on that, but I understand that is up. It's not up as much as it's been in North Carolina, as I understand. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah, the national trend is ridership is up across all the products that Amtrak offers. The long distance product is up, as you know, and Richard mentioned that those services in his previous comments. Those are Amtrak system trains. They're not NC by train or the state supported service that we provide. But it is an ecosystem of travel. So folks are transferring between those trains and our trains. Throughout the system, and the result is increased ridership overall.
When we come back, I want to talk about this ecosystem of trains because it's a little confusing for people. It's not like a plane or a bus. We're coming right back at Charlotte Talks.
On the next Charlotte Talks, the United States has an increasing number of homeless people and many chronically homeless. Dr. Brian Klausner has spent his career taking care of these people as patients and says the time has come to address the problem, but it will require solutions grounded in our shared values and ideals. His latest book addresses how we can come together, and some of his ideas have bipartisan support. He shares them with us tomorrow morning at 9, right here on 90.7 WFAE.
Do you love Charlotte Talks? Subscribe to the Charlotte Talks podcast to hear Mike Collins explore the stories that matter with experts, politicians, thought leaders, and voices from the Charlotte community, all at your convenience. You'll learn about the issues shaping our community with insightful conversations on politics, health, education, the arts, and more. Subscribe to the Charlotte Talks podcast at WFAE.org/podcasts.
For the millions serving time inside, there are just as many on the outside affected by our prison system. Kiana Harris has a new memoir called Mainline Mama. She writes about navigating prison through marriage and children, a journey that required long drives, building a life through letters, and leaning on a community of women. How loved ones are affected by incarceration. That's next time on 1A.
And you can tune into 1A coming up this morning at 10 o'clock right here on 90.7 WFAE.
It's Charlotte Talks on listener-funded 90.7 WFAE and WFAE.org. I'm Mike Collins. We're here with Jason Orthner, who is Rail Division Director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Beau Mills is Chairman of North Carolinians for Passenger Rail. And Richard Stradling has written about all of this, about trains, as transportation reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. And we're talking about trains. And Beau, when passengers opt to take the train rather than to drive or to fly, what appears to be the deciding factor? Is it price? Is it convenience? Is it because trains can be more comfortable, more leisurely, because they have more time to get to and from one place or another? What's the reason?
I'll tell you, Mike, you named three things there. We're batting 1,000. I think all three of your questions are right on point. It is a really convenient way to travel. It is inexpensive, and the experience is extraordinary. I take a train between Raleigh and Charlotte on a frequent basis, and the experience I have is so different than the white-knuckled I-85 drive to Charlotte that I sometimes have to do. I can rest. I can have a snack, can sit at a table and work on my laptop. Recently, I took the day trip to Charlotte, Mike, where I got on the train in Cary, 15 minutes from my home, parked in the parking lot, jumped on the train, and showed up in Charlotte, not exhausted from that drive, but I actually was able to prepare the presentation that I had to give 30 minutes after I rode into Charlotte. So it was really, what a wow experience. Such a difference from taking a plane where you have to show up 2 hours early and go through TSA. It's just a superior experience in so many ways. And Jason and his team have done such a great job of putting together a program for us in North Carolina to really enjoy that. I saw Richard had a comment.
Yeah, Richard, go ahead.
I just want to point out that the train works best when you're going to a destination that is like a downtown, like Charlotte or Raleigh. I mean, and I lived in New England for 8 years and rode the train a lot up there, and it was extremely competitive with flying for the reasons you talk about. But if you're going to New York, the train drops you off right in Manhattan, as opposed to out in Queens somewhere where you then got to spend $80 to get into the city. Washington, Philadelphia, Baltimore, if you're going to the center of those cities and they have the mass transit you need and you don't need to drive out to, suburban Maryland or something, then the train is great. If you're going to Charlotte because you're actually going to Gastonia or, Lake Norman or something like that, you're probably going to end up driving. And so, it works really well. We went to a Panthers game in the fall, and we went on Saturday, spent the night, went to some museums, restaurant, went to the game. But everything was right in uptown Charlotte. That's, we weren't going into South Carolina or something like that where we would want to have our car. So.
Well, talk to me about, since you take the train a lot, Beau, talk to me about the difference in travel time, say from Raleigh to Charlotte or vice versa, versus traveling in a car. Talk about the cost, gasoline versus the fare.
Well, as a single rider, it is cheaper to take the train. I think, what is it, Jason? It's like $40. If I do that and charge my employer, it's like $200 for mileage. to drive to Charlotte and back. So it's definitely a better deal financially. And then, as I said earlier, the experience is just dramatically different. You know your train's going to be there on time, right, Jason? And we know that driving through Charlotte, driving down to Charlotte, and the traffic and the construction is always a challenge, and you're never really confident.
Well, I was going to ask you to give me the good, the bad, and the ugly of train travel. I've heard no ugly here yet. Is there any ugly to be told?
I think that I'll be really frank that because they share the tracks with the freight trains, that sometimes we have some delays every once in a while on the train. But those delays are sitting, back in a really comfortable chair with a cup of coffee in your hand, as opposed to banging on the steering wheel while you're trying to wait in traffic. So it's a different experience. But I've seen some tremendous improvement on the performance of the train over the last few years as well.
So, Jason, despite these rising ridership numbers here and evidently nationwide on Amtrak, I will wager that most people have never taken the train, uh, and they don't think of them. And if they think of them at all, they think of them as freight vehicles that haul all kinds of things around the country. Airports, on the other hand, are these thriving, bustling, ever modernized places. I mean, Charlotte Douglas has a ways to go, but it's always under construction, and they're always trying to make improvements. But train stations outside of places like Richard mentioned, like New York's Grand Central or Union Station in Washington, train stations can be iffy. And I think we can use Charlotte as an example at the moment, although there are plans to improve that. Some of these train stations in the smaller areas, it would seem to me, probably haven't been changed since the 1940s. So, how would you describe that aspect of waiting for the train, getting off the train, etc.?
We have spent a lot of time over the last 20 to 25 years. We have made significant investments in the passenger experience, including the stations. Now I will say the Charlotte station, we have a plan and we're working through that to actually bring it to Uptown. And so that experience will dramatically change once that project is complete. But for most of our other, or nearly all of our other stations, they've been updated. Yes, a lot of cases they're historic structures, and the communities that they are in, they're proud of these structures. But they've been updated, modernized, and are generally very, very well lit, comfortable places that harken to the history of rail travel.
Richard, I think it was Jason who mentioned the ecosystem of train travel, because we have Amtrak, which covers much of the country, not all of it, and we have these various other programs like NC by Train, which I think is separate from Amtrak, although it may use some Amtrak trains or tracks. Am I right about that, Jason?
So NC by Train is our state support service, and
Right.
yes, Amtrak is our contractor for the actual movement of our trains, and we use their equipment for the Carolinian service, and we use state-owned equipment for the Piedmont service.
But there's something else. As I was listening to all these old Amtrak commercials, trying to find the jingles that I wanted to use at the top of the show, Richard, I was hearing them talk about all these names for trains and train lines, and we have them too. The Piedmont, the Carolinian, the Floridian. These are trains. That's maybe a little confusing for the ordinary person who, when they think about going to New York, they go to their web site, and they choose an airline, and they just pick New York as a destination. And the most they need to know, perhaps, is that we are called CLT in Charlotte, and LaGuardia is LGA. They may not even have to know that. But what are they to make of the Piedmont, of the Carolinian, of the Floridian? Is that making it more confusing for people?
I don't think so. I mean, the Piedmont's fairly straightforward. It runs between Raleigh and Charlotte, and it's got the stations in between. If you're searching for a train from North Carolina to New York, say, there aren't a lot of options. So I don't think it would confuse you to look at the Carolinian. If you're going from Durham, there's really just one option to go to New York, and that's going to be the Carolinian. There are these through trains that are options, but I think if you go on the website, and the Amtrak website or the NC by Train website, and you want to buy a ticket to New York, I think it's fairly straightforward.
Is that a problem? I mean, when you're going to fly someplace, you either are a frequent flyer with one airline or another, or you know the names of airlines that fly to your local airport, and you get on their website and you book a flight, or you use one of those trip apps to book a flight. Can you do the same thing with train travel?
Yes. Go ahead, Jason. I can.
The short answer is absolutely. The Amtrak app is very much like it is built just like one of your airline apps with destination. You put in destinations, and it basically is not choosing a train for you based on the name. It's basically a time of day, which is exactly the way you would pick, an airline. It is very straightforward. The pricing is very straightforward. And especially, between Raleigh and Charlotte, you're not going to pay a different price based upon the time of day you travel. It's very clear. And so most of our travelers, will buy tickets, day of or day before, and use that for the flexibility of their travel.
So
Hey,
as I
and
understand,
Jason, Mike, I'll add to what Jason was saying. I was in Charlotte. I mentioned I was down there recently to give a presentation, prepared the presentation on the train, got off the train, gave the presentation, finished early. So then I just quickly looked at my phone and said, oh, there's an earlier train. I'm just going to go to the train station and get on an earlier train. It was sold out, but they said, come on, we'll make room for you. And I was able to get home 3 hours earlier. You can't do that on a plane. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. And Jason, they did a great job. They found a seat for me. It was sold out, but they still found a seat.
So, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, Amtrak is subsidized throughout the country. NC by train is what we call our system, which is subsidized by the state. And Richard reports that it costs the state about $10 million a year. With 720,758 passengers, all told, in 2024, is that a good investment as compared to what we spend on roads or how public money goes to airports?
So, the rail system, when we talk about an ecosystem, it is a little bit different. It is completely backwards from the way that we fund roads. Roads is an entirely publicly funded, system. The infrastructure is publicly funded, basically and supported through public funds. The rail system is nearly entirely it's a private system, entirely private system. And so we make investments in that system. When we add passenger trains, we're basically that is the public investment, in that particular system versus, what in highways it's primarily, the infrastructure itself. So yes, there's a public funding component in rail, just like there's in highways, but ours is more in the operation of the system. So, I think to the question on its value, clearly people are using the system, to get between these points. We're handling, that number of people, but it's also, if you think about 720,000 people roughly, that's about 125 million passenger miles. These are long trips, 100 to 200 miles that we're taking those cars off the road, freeing them up that congestion so that the roads stay free, as well as, you have this access to the rail system.
Beau.
I was just going to say, we spend billions of dollars on adding additional lanes to our highways. And if we have, and then 5 years later, they're sitting in traffic on those new lanes. I mean, we've seen that happen, especially in our fast growing urban areas, Mike. And then if you invest in rail, all Jason has to do is put another train on the track and another route. I mean, we can carry more people without investing massive amounts of dollars to move people between these stations. It's really, I think it's a really smart investment to put money into passenger rail because it's easily expanded without much extra cost.
Beau, in your old job with the North Carolina Metropolitan Mayors Coalition and the North Carolina League of Municipalities, you worked with leaders, mayors, councils, commissions in cities and towns across the state. And I was going to ask you if they were on board, these leaders on board with train travel and the expansion of train travel. And then I read that in a letter to Jason from the North Carolina Metropolitan Mayors Coalition, this quote, which says the mayors say, quote, "The excitement for passenger rail amongst our mayors is palpable." Why haven't we heard more talk about this then?
there's so many things that they're dealing with every day, Mike. But this is definitely, we spent time, we went around the state. In fact, Jason attended some of those. I think Richard maybe attended one of, we did public meetings around the state 2 years ago talking about the opportunities that passenger rail offers. And the mayors themselves are very engaged. We talked earlier about the train stations. A number of our cities have invested local tax dollars. Pretty significant numbers of mayors across the state are talking about reinvesting in their train stations. I actually, Mike, was on the phone yesterday with the mayor of Marion, North Carolina, Steve Little, who is a strong advocate and a fellow board member for North Carolinians for Passenger Rail. And he talked about how they have renovated their train station in Marion in anticipation of a train going to Asheville. So that's a level of commitment you're seeing.
Speaking of commitment, Jason, you work the government, and I know you can't get political, but the legislature has to help fund all of this, make decisions about funding on all of this. And in Charlotte, as you probably are aware, we've been trying to expand our local transportation system, and we had a transportation plan that included 5 commuter rail or light rail lines that the legislative leaders criticized as being too rail-centric and not road-centric, because people use the roads, they don't take the train. And so we've pared that down now to our current Blue Line rail and maybe something that will be a couple of miles long called the Silver Line, which has ruffled some feathers locally. If the legislature's not on board with that kind of rail, are they on board with NC by rail and other aspects of train travel?
Well, a couple things. One, we certainly appreciate the support of the General Assembly, and they support not just our passenger rail program, but our safety program, our freight program, where we support, the entirety of the 3,500 miles of railroad in the state, making sure that it's driving economic development. In fact, it drives a lot of economic development, $20 billion annually, to be exact, and about 88,000 jobs. So there's a lot of reasons to invest in the rail system as a whole. The issues with rail transportation, obviously in the Shaw region, it's looked at as a regional solution to congestion problems and getting mobility within the city itself. Obviously, our product is an intercity rail project connecting the downtowns of cities and towns together, both rural and urban areas. It's a different product. It can actually, the two can complement each other by having a last
correct me if I'm wrong. It could all be part of the same ecosystem. You could get off the train from Raleigh in Charlotte and hop on the Blue Line, the Silver Line, the Red Line, and go to, as you said, Huntersville or Davidson easily.
That is exactly right. It is part of a sort of a last mile solution. Our train delivers you over the distance. Those systems can deliver you to your last mile, to where your final destination is. And it does help in an urban environment where there is significant congestion in trying to provide a seamless trip.
I have 30 seconds left. Richard, what's your take on legislative support for trains in general?
Well, I do think a lot of legislators are from rural areas that aren't served by the train and may not see it as something that benefits their local community. But here, the mayor of Marion, that was news to me. That sounds pretty interesting. That's somebody who appreciates the train.
Richard Stradling is transportation reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. He's here with Beau Mills, chairman of North Carolinians for Passenger Rail, and Jason Orthner, the rail division director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. And we are coming right back. Stay with us.
It's Charlotte Talks. Coming up in 20 minutes, bird flu has now spread to cows in Arizona and Nevada. Avian influenza has killed millions of birds and caused egg prices to soar since it first emerged in U.S. poultry in 2022. What do we know about the strain detected in cows, and how might it affect mitigation efforts? Those stories and more in 20 minutes on 1A, right here on WFAE.
Are you tired of sifting through countless news articles and sponsored posts to find the stories that matter about Charlotte? Well, we've got a solution for you. Newsworthy, the daily news podcast from WFAE. We share the top stories every morning, saving you time and keeping you informed. Subscribe to Newsworthy, available now everywhere you get your podcasts.
Hey everybody, it's Kai Risdall from Marketplace. If you happened to have gotten a new car over the weekend, maybe a new electric car, and you're wondering what to do with the old one, you could donate it to WFAE. Whether it's running or not, your car or truck could bring significant funds that help keep Marketplace and everything else on the station running smoothly. The process is easy, the pickup is free, and your gift to WFAE is tax deductible. Win-win. Here's how to give. Go to WFAE.org/cars to get started.
It's Charlotte Talks on Listener Funded, 90.7 WFAE and WFHE. I'm Mike Collins. Jason Orthner's with us, Rail Division Director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Beau Mills, Chairman of the North Carolinians for Passenger Rail, a new advocacy group recently established. And Richard Stradling is transportation reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Jason, NCDOT submitted 12 rail corridors in May of 2023 to the U.S. Department of Transportation and their Federal Rail Administration's Competitive Discretionary Grant program. That's a mouthful. 7 corridors out of those 12 were selected: Atlanta to Charlotte, Charlotte to Kings Mountain, Charlotte to Washington, Fayetteville to Raleigh, Salisbury to Asheville, Wilmington to Raleigh, and Winston-Salem to Raleigh. That was in 2023. I'm assuming that all the tracks to carry those trains still exist on those corridors, but is this just a matter of funding the running of passenger trains on these corridors then? And what is the status of those routes right now?
So you bring up this FRA Corridor Identification Development Program. That is a first of its kind program to actually create a true programmatic pathway to developing new intercity passenger rail corridors in the country. Our state was really was well awarded in this program by really receiving more corridors than any other state. And we had a very smart map. We've heard from communities all across the state, that were interested in expanding the service beyond just the sort of the center of the state, the Raleigh to Charlotte corridor, core, reaching destinations like, Asheville, Salisbury, Asheville, down to Wilmington, more service to Fayetteville, more service to Winston-Salem, and Kings Mountain, and those other locations you mentioned. This program provides a pathway for us to develop those corridors in a very smart way, working with our railroad partners who primarily own the infrastructure outright, and provide a pathway to actually seeing them through.
The grants totaled, I think, $3.5 million, and you still haven't answered my question about what the status of those routes are. How is that money scheduled to be used? Is that money still available? Is there a timeline for these things to start running on these tracks, or what's the deal?
Right. So the funding that was provided is in place. We're already in process on all 7 corridors of advancing the work under what we call the step 1, which is developing the implementation plan for those corridors. The next step is to do the hard work of working directly with the railroads on developing a service plan and all the infrastructure needed to make sure that those trains can run. And we also support both existing freight and future freight as well. So those steps are going through. We're engaged with the Federal Railroad Administration and have not skipped a beat on our process.
I don't know how many people both fly from Charlotte to Raleigh. I'm sure there's a number of people who do, but mostly you fly to cities farther away. But talk about time. No, you don't have to go through airport security. No, you don't have to get there an hour ahead of time. But what is it? How does the time difference? Like if you're going to go from Charlotte to Raleigh, or Charlotte to Richmond, or Charlotte to Washington on a train versus a car or plane, what's the time difference? Because trains stop. It's not necessarily non-stop between cities.
That's correct. So, and it really is the stopping time that, that factors into it. So our current product, has got trains that make, most stops, and then we have some that have more limited stops that allow the trip time to be much reduced. We have under 3-hour trips on our fastest trains between Raleigh and Charlotte. Right now, you mentioned Washington. Right now, we have the Carolinian, one of the most successful trains in the Amtrak system, takes a fairly circuitous route going south out of Raleigh down to Selma and then going back north, that's a longer trip to Washington than what we hope to achieve with the S-Line program, which will shave off an hour and a half, up to an hour and a half off that travel time. So bring it closer to the 4 to 4.5 hour vehicle time for that trip. It's longer now. But this is a process that we are continually working on with the railroads and the Federal Railroad Administration to make the trip faster, more productive, more efficient.
Beau.
I was just going to add something Jason alluded to is continued effort. The Piedmont, I think, Jason, dates back to 1995. In fact, you'll be celebrating the service between Raleigh and Charlotte 30 years of that on May 25th of this year. So that is a continual effort of steady investment the state has made in passenger rail. And that's the same investment that Jason's alluding to improve the service between Charlotte, Raleigh, and Washington, D.C. And I think that is a perfect way to look at expanding passenger rail, thinking about it as incremental continued investments. North Carolina has been a leader in the country in their efforts to support state focused rail service. And it's something that we should be really proud of. It dates back to Governor Martin, who was from the Charlotte area, Davidson, a Republican governor who he put together a rail commission that talked about it. And they actually pointed out in the 1990, I think, that we really need a service between Raleigh and Charlotte that was specific to North Carolina. And we see that result now with a really expanded and very popular service.
Now, Richard, in 2023, you reported that NCDOT had received $1 billion federal grant to begin building high-speed passenger trains between Raleigh and Richmond, Virginia. And this was the result of the bipartisan infrastructure law that passed during the Biden administration. And you called a big economic win for the economic development of the region by North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis. North Carolina Secretary of Transportation bragged that it would make the trip to Washington more car competitive. But how? It would only run between Raleigh and Richmond, which is what? A good 2 hours from D.C. by car. How would it make the trip by car? How would it make it car competitive?
Well, the trains would continue on to. So this development project that Virginia and North Carolina are working on together is the Richmond to Raleigh segment of it. But Virginia is working on improving and they have existing rail service between Richmond and Washington. So they're working on improving that side of it as well. So when you think of it, it really is getting you to Washington sooner, even though we're just talking about the development of the Richmond to Raleigh segment, which is not a passenger corridor right now.
So what would that cost? Because it would seem to me that I don't know what the travel time between Washington and D.C. off the top of my head by car is, probably 6.5 hours from Charlotte. You can be on an airplane and probably get there in 90 minutes? Once you go through TSA security and get there ahead of time. What's the cost differential? Because it would take longer to get there by train, even at high speed, wouldn't it?
Yeah, flying from Charlotte, yes. I'm not sure that if it would necessarily be that competitive with flying from Raleigh.
These trains run 110 miles per hour, I think. That's the schedule. High-speed rail is common in parts of Asia and parts of Europe. Do we have, Jason, any operational high-speed lines in the United States? Any?
So currently the Northeast Corridor, which is between Washington, D.C. and Boston, operates up to 160 miles an hour today.
Is that the Acela train?
That's the Acela train. That's correct. And so that is currently the fastest rail service in North America right now. The Brightline West project that's connecting the Los Angeles area to Las Vegas, it anticipates speeds up to 220 miles an hour. That's a project that's actively under development. So there are some projects, that do have very high speeds. That typically requires dedicated tracks and a significant investment in infrastructure. To Beau's point before that he made before, part of the strategy that we're using in North Carolina is to try to make sure that we do incremental improvements that are reasonably affordable, that benefit both freight and passenger together, so that you get basically the benefits of the entire ecosystem of the rail network. So that does tend to keep you at speeds of 110 miles an hour, something like that, which does generate faster trip times. But it is a trade-off between ultra high speed and the costs that come with that.
I want to share a listener comment that's come in while we've been talking. For an older person, I'm less and less confident and possibly safe driving from Charlotte to Durham, where my son lives. Trains! Exclamation point, exclamation point. I'm doing it. Met families on day trips, other seniors like myself, and young college students. It's not easy or desirable to drive in many cases, especially for an aging population. The train was great. Think the future, build more trains. Which brings me, Jason, to this question. The Biden administration was perhaps the most train-friendly administration since Lincoln. I mean, Joe Biden was known for riding the train every day of his Senate career between Washington and Delaware to go home every night to his family. So he loved trains. He was in favor of that. What's the stance of the current administration?
Well, we're very early in the current administration, and so we're still working through what exactly will be the policy from the USDOT. We're still very much in contact with USDOT. I will say that on our S-Line project, the first grants that we won were through the first Trump administration, so we were already receiving bipartisan support, even as we were entering into sort of the implementation phase of that project. So we're, this is an opportunity for us to build some transformational infrastructure that's beautiful, big, and does some really amazing things, for moving people and goods. So those are things that I think mesh with, the objectives of the current administration.
Richard, Donald Trump promised Infrastructure Week almost every week of his last administration and never followed through. And then he sounded off negatively, repeatedly, against the bipartisan infrastructure bill that made its way through Congress during the Biden administration. It passed despite all of his bluster and, in fact, threats to lawmakers who supported the bill. But on his first day in office, Donald Trump issued an executive order requiring agencies to stop disbursement of funds on the infrastructure law, along with stopping other federal grants and other forms of funding. Some people allege that doing so is illegal, but nonetheless, he did it, and it's hard to keep up with because this changes moment by moment with courts staying those orders and his defying those orders and new stays being executed. But where does it stand? Where do the funds for trains put forth by Congress in the infrastructure bill stand this morning?
So as you said, he put a hold on grants from the infrastructure bill that had not been committed. There were not agreements for, and so it wasn't just trains, it was everything. So the Alligator River Bridge in the eastern part of the state, there are a number of road projects that were also put on hold. And Jason's boss, the Secretary of Transportation, Joey Hopkins, and Josh Stein, the governor, asked Sean Duffy, the new Secretary of Transportation, specifically about the S-Line project, which is the $1.1 billion grant to build the first leg of that high-speed rail corridor from Raleigh up to Wake Forest. And his response was that he made it sound like this was somewhat of a routine pause, but they have not indicated, and Jason may have heard something more recently, but I've been checking with DOT, the US DOT, to find out if they've got any kind of movement on this or make any decisions, and I have not heard of any yet. And Jason, is that still paused as far as you know?
So I think we are experiencing a pause right now generally, and I'll say that this is not uncommon for new administrations. We experienced a similar pause when the previous administration came in, as they were reviewing grants and objectives and policy, of the prior administration. So we continue to, work with the federal administration and prepare everything right now as if it's going, as if everything is going to happen.
Beau.
I was just going to add, and I know that we're getting ready to wrap up here in a second, Mike. We have support, bipartisan support in both the Congress and in the state legislature. We had bills introduced last year in the legislature that set funding, continual funding as a possibility for our rail development in North Carolina. I think everyone is buying into the idea that rail is part of our future. We're seeing that grow. We're seeing the success of the one line between Raleigh and Charlotte. We really envision seeing trains running to Asheville. We see trains running to Wilmington, connecting people and giving opportunity to both urban and rural residents to connect in ways that they can't today. And we're very, very excited about what we can do in North Carolina with rail. And we see that support growing every day.
Richard, last week, the Trump administration said that the U.S. Department of Transportation would award grant money for highways and new transit projects based in part on which communities have higher than average marriage and birth rates. Do you understand the connection?
Well, Sean Duffy was asked about that actually on his visit to North Carolina, and he said that that was sort of a proxy for growing areas. And it is one of many criteria that they're using. I don't know that it's going to become the deciding factor in any decision that the federal government makes. But if you consider that a proxy of an area that's growing, okay. But then there'll be some politics involved in that, I'm sure.
And Jason, I have less than a minute left, but U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy also said that these funding decisions would be based on, quote, sound economic principles and analysis supported by rigorous cost-benefit requirements and data-driven decisions. Are you convinced that the projects that we have on the drawing board, that you have proposed, that you have funding for, are seeking funding for, will pass those tests?
I am. In fact, we did an analysis on our $1 billion grant and determined that just in the period of implementation of the project, it yields $1.4 billion in economic output and over 8,000 job years and generates $42.5 million of state and local tax revenue. So these projects do, I mean, just while they're being done, generate real economic activity.
Jason Orthner is Rail Division Director for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. He joined us along with Beau Mills, Chairman of the North Carolinians for Passenger Rail, and Richard Stradling, Transportation Reporter for the Raleigh News and Observer. Thank you all.
Charlotte Talks is a production of 90.7 WFAE. Support for Charlotte Talks comes from Mazda of South Charlotte. Our executive producer is Gabe Altieri. The senior producer